Let's talk about something serious. When people hear the word war, they usually imagine maps, missiles, generals, speeches, flags, but that's not really the right way to begin. If you want to understand a thing properly, you don't begin with the noise. You begin with the mechanism. You ask what is actually happening, what are the moving parts, and what follows from those parts moving the way they do. That's the only sensible way to think, because what is happening right now is not merely a quarrel between two governments. It is not just one more crisis to add to the evening news. It is the kind of event that changes the behavior of entire systems. And when a large system changes suddenly, the consequences spread far beyond the place where the first explosion occurred. They travel through oil markets, through shipping routes, through currencies, through insurance, through elections, through dinner tables, through grocery bills, through fear itself. So the real question is not who shouted first or whose propaganda sounds more convincing. The real question is much simpler and much more important. Do you understand the machine you are living inside? Because if you don't understand the machine, then when it starts shaking, you will mistake every vibration for randomness. And it isn't random. Large events have structure. They have logic. They have momentum. And if you can see even a little of that structure, you are less likely to panic, less likely to be manipulated, and more likely to make sensible choices for yourself and the people you care about. Now, according to the sequence laid out in the source material, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, large, coordinated strikes against Iran. Within hours, the reported damage was extraordinary. Senior officials killed, command centers hit, broadcasting infrastructure struck, military headquarters damaged, and even Iran's parliament attacked during a moment of political transition. If that description is even approximately correct, then we are not talking about a symbolic strike. We are talking about an attempt to alter the balance of power in one violent stroke. And history tells you something about moments like that. They are dangerous not only because of the damage they do immediately, but because they compress time. They force everybody else in the system to react quickly, imperfectly, emotionally. 100 slow political calculations get replaced by one urgent question: what do we do now? That is when systems become unstable. A lot of people like to compare every modern conflict to some earlier one, usually badly. But there is one lesson from history that is worth remembering. Sometimes a single action does not remain a single action. It becomes a trigger. One event in one place involving one set of actors suddenly activates treaty obligations, supply chains, military doctrines, ideological rivalries, domestic politics, and economic panic across continents. That is not poetry. That is mechanics. One part moves, so the connected parts move. And what happened next, in the version of events your script describes, is exactly the kind of thing that turns a regional war into a global economic shock. Iran did not simply retaliate against Israel. Iran moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, to many people, that sounds like just another name on a map, some narrow strip of water somewhere far away. But that is because most people hear place names without hearing their function. And function is what matters. The Strait of Hormuz is not just water. It is a valve. Imagine that the world economy is a giant industrial plant. It has factories, trucks, ships, data centers, power stations, fertilizer plants, hospitals, refrigeration networks, supermarkets, airports. All of that machinery needs energy. A significant fraction of that energy passes through one narrow channel. So when you close that channel, you are not merely interrupting ships, you are squeezing the fuel line of the global machine. That's the right picture. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day pass through that strait. That is about a fifth of the world's daily oil supply, moving through a very narrow corridor. If you like simple physical images, think of a city trying to breathe through a straw. The city may be large, rich, sophisticated, modern, but if the opening narrows, the whole body feels it. And that is why people who say, well, it's just one waterway in the Middle East, are not thinking clearly. It is not just one waterway, it is a choke point in a tightly coupled system. And tightly coupled systems are efficient right up until the moment they aren't. Then they become brittle. Your script mentions shipping companies suspending transit, insurers pulling coverage, tanker traffic falling nearly to zero, and Qatar halting production and declaring force majeure on gas contracts. Again, I am not checking those claims here, I am rewriting the structure of the argument, but if that chain of events occurs, the consequences are perfectly understandable. Shipping companies are not philosophers, they do arithmetic. If missiles are flying and insurers refuse to cover the cargo, then the voyage is no longer a commercial voyage. It becomes a gamble. So the ships wait, the fuel waits, the gas waits, the refineries wait, and then, because nothing in the world economy is isolated, everybody else begins paying for the waiting. This is one of the hardest things for the public to grasp, because the connection between a missile strike and the price of milk on a supermarket shelf seems abstract. But it isn't abstract at all. It is beautifully, almost cruelly direct. Food requires fertilizer. Fertilizer requires energy. Packaging requires energy. Transportation requires energy. Cooling requires energy. Warehousing requires energy. Even the software and logistics systems coordinating modern supply chains depend on a grid that depends somewhere downstream on fuel. So when energy becomes unstable, the price of ordinary life rises, not because somebody somewhere is evil in a cartoonish way, but because physical systems have costs, and when the input cost rises, the final price rises too. That's why this is not only a military story, it is a systems story. And here is another interesting thing. The countries most exposed are not necessarily the countries where the bombs are falling. Often the most exposed are the countries whose prosperity depends on uninterrupted flow. Asia, in particular, sits in a delicate position here. Japan, South Korea, China, India, Singapore, these are not just nations on a map. They are high-functioning industrial organisms. They require steady energy intake. Japan and South Korea rely heavily on Middle Eastern imports. China gets a major share of its oil through that corridor. India, too. Singapore is one of the most important refining and trading hubs in the world. So if the Strait of Hormuz closes, Asia does not simply observe the event. Asia feels it in its bloodstream. This is important because many people still think geopolitics in old-fashioned terms. Who hates whom? Who threatened whom? Who is morally righteous? Who is morally guilty? Those questions matter, but they are not enough. The deeper question is, who is structurally vulnerable? A system can look strong and still be vulnerable if it depends too much on one narrow passage, one supplier, one technology, one alliance, one assumption. Modern Asia built astonishing prosperity over the last several decades. Hundreds of millions of people rose out of poverty. Cities grew upward and outward at extraordinary speed. Manufacturing, logistics, trade, finance, technology, all of it expanded magnificently. But prosperity built on complex flows inherits the vulnerabilities of those flows. If the flow is disturbed, the prosperity trembles. Now, another mistake people make is to imagine that this is simply America on one side and Iran on the other. That is far too childish a picture. Great power systems never work that way. There are always other observers, other beneficiaries, other silent participants, other governments asking not who is right, but what does this do to the board? Russia, for instance, has obvious reasons to benefit from disruption in Middle Eastern energy flows. If one source becomes unstable, another source becomes more valuable. That is not ideology. That is pricing. If the world suddenly needs more non-Gulf crude, Russia's position improves. Its revenue position improves. Its leverage improves. China's position is more delicate and more fascinating. China wants stability because instability threatens growth, threatens trade, threatens energy access, threatens domestic economic management. But China also watches American power very carefully. Every major American military action is, from Beijing's point of view, a lesson. Not necessarily a lesson about morality, but a lesson about capability, endurance, cost, and political will. If America acts quickly and succeeds cleanly, that sends one message. If America becomes entangled, spends enormous sums, strains alliances, and fails to achieve a stable end state, that sends another. So China is not simply watching a war. China is watching a demonstration. And it is asking, what does this tell us about the structure of power in the 21st century? That is why you must be careful with official statements. Governments say many things for diplomatic reasons, but what matters most is often not what they say. It is what constraints they reveal, what resources they mobilize, what risks they tolerate, and what timelines they appear to be planning for. The United States, meanwhile, faces its own kind of trap, the trap of escalation without clarity. It is one thing to launch a military operation. It is another thing entirely to define what counts as success. If the goal is punishment, that is one kind of campaign. If the goal is deterrence, that is another. If the goal is regime collapse, that is another. If the goal is strategic transformation of the region, that is another still. And each one carries different costs, different timelines, different risks of failure. The public often hears the beginning of wars described with confidence. The end of wars is usually much murkier. This is because destroying things is mechanically simpler than stabilizing what remains. Anybody with enough force can smash a machine. Rebuilding a machine while people are still fighting over the pieces is much harder. According to your original script, America is spending staggering sums, the war continues without full political consensus at home, and Iran has responded with missiles, drones, and threats of prolonged resistance. Whether every figure is exact is less important for the structure of the argument than the underlying reality. Once a conflict becomes prolonged, every participant starts adapting, and adaptation is the key word. The side that seemed shocked on day 1 may become dangerous on day 10. The side that looked overwhelmingly strong at the beginning may find itself paying a high price for every additional day of involvement. The public too adapts. Outrage becomes fatigue. Fatigue becomes division. Division becomes political pressure. That is how modern conflicts spread, not only across borders but through time. Your script also points to Hezbollah, militias in Iraq, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, and the wider strain on shipping routes. This is exactly the sort of broad systemic entanglement one should worry about. Once many actors with different incentives and different thresholds begin interacting in the same crisis space, predictability drops sharply. And when predictability drops, insurance rises, transport slows, markets shiver, and politicians begin making decisions under pressure instead of under reason. That is a bad recipe. There is another aspect here that people dislike discussing because it is uncomfortable. When a state feels existentially threatened, its incentives change. If leadership is decapitated, infrastructure attacked, sovereignty humiliated, and survival placed in question, then the appeal of ultimate deterrence grows. That is why the question of nuclear capability matters so much. History teaches a grim lesson here. States observe what happens to other states. They ask, who was invaded? Who was not invaded? Who surrendered leverage and later regretted it? Who held leverage and remained untouchable? These are not academic questions to governments under threat. They become survival questions. So if Iran's leadership concludes that only a stronger deterrent can prevent future decapitation or invasion, then the long-term danger of this conflict may be greater than the immediate one. Military action intended to delay one threat can, under certain conditions, intensify the incentive to pursue it. That's one of the great ironies of strategic behavior. What appears forceful in the short term can produce the opposite of the intended result in the long term. Now let's step back, because there's a human tendency to get hypnotized by the large map and forget the small lives. But the small lives are the whole point. The map is just an abstraction. Children killed, families displaced, young soldiers dead, sirens in the night, civilians waking in fear, workers wondering whether prices will rise again, parents looking at their savings and doing nervous arithmetic. These are not side effects in some trivial sense. They are the actual substance of what war means in human life. Politicians speak in nouns like security, deterrence, sovereignty, response. Ordinary people pay in groceries, in grief, in uncertainty, in funerals, in interrupted futures. And because I want to keep the tone honest, let me say something plainly. War is not cleverness. It is failure at a very high energy level. Sometimes governments argue that it has become necessary, perhaps even unavoidable. Perhaps, but even then it remains a sign that many other forms of understanding broke down first. Missiles are what conversation looks like when conversation has collapsed. That is why one of the most dangerous things in moments like this is not merely violence, but simplification. The public is handed simple stories because simple stories are emotionally satisfying. Good side, bad side, strength, weakness, victory, defeat. But real systems are rarely that neat, and the price of believing neat stories is that you become easy to steer. So what should an ordinary person do? First, do not confuse panic with seriousness. Panic is useless. Seriousness is useful. Seriousness means looking at your finances, your dependencies, your exposure to inflation, your contingency plans. If energy costs rise, many other costs may follow. That's not mystical. That's arithmetic. Build cushion where you can. Reduce foolish risk where you can. Do not gamble on stability if the system is visibly unstable. Second, diversify your information. It is astonishing how many intelligent people ruin their understanding by listening to only one narrative source. If you hear only America's account, you will see one shape. If you hear only Iran's account, you will see another. If you hear only China's framing, or Europe's framing, or social media's framing, you will see still another. Truth in public affairs is often not contained neatly inside one camp's story. You approach it asymptotically, by comparing perspectives, identifying incentives, noticing omissions, and staying intellectually humble. Ask always, who benefits if I think about this in exactly the way I am being encouraged to think about it? That question alone will save you from a great deal of manipulation. Third, invest in people, not only in positions. During large disruptions, relationships become a kind of hidden infrastructure. Family, trusted friends, community, professional networks. These often matter more than people realize. In textbooks, crises are described in terms of GDP and military assets. In real life, they are survived through trust, cooperation, shared information, and mutual help. Fourth, remember that crisis also rearranges opportunity. I don't mean that in a cold-hearted way. I do not mean one should celebrate suffering. I mean simply that when systems change abruptly, new needs emerge. Energy transition accelerates. Supply chains get redesigned. Storage technology matters more. Regional manufacturing matters more. Alternative transport corridors matter more. Risk analysis matters more. Local resilience matters more. Every great shift in the world creates pain, yes, but it also creates demand for new solutions. And the people who build those solutions are rarely the ones staring helplessly at headlines all day. They are the ones asking what problem has now become impossible to ignore. That is a very fruitful question. If this crisis continues, countries will almost certainly push harder on energy diversification, strategic reserves, renewables, nuclear power, grid resilience, and supply chain redesign. Asia may be especially well positioned in some of those domains because it already has deep industrial capacity in solar, batteries, electronics, and large-scale manufacturing. So even in the middle of danger, there are directional clues about where the future may be going, and that really is the heart of intelligent preparation. The future does not belong merely to the strongest or the richest at any given moment. It belongs more often than people think to those who notice structural change early and adjust before the crowd does. That's true in business, it's true in science, it's true in geopolitics, it's true in life. Now, if you are sitting in Southeast Asia, there is a particularly important lesson here. Much of the region's success has come from flexibility. Trading broadly, aligning carefully, avoiding unnecessary entrapment in great power rivalry, and keeping strategic room to maneuver. That has been a very intelligent approach. But a world of sharper confrontation puts pressure on that model. If the United States and China become more openly opposed across multiple theaters, neutrality becomes harder to maintain in practice, even when it remains desirable in principle. Trade, finance, technology, shipping, energy, security guarantees, these things begin to pull in different directions. And ordinary people need to understand that, because ordinary people are not separate from grand strategy. They vote, they consume, they invest, they build companies, they react to prices, they shape national mood, they determine which political messages land and which do not. So being informed is not some academic hobby, it is a civic function. The greatest defense against chaos is not bravado, it is understanding. Not perfect understanding, nobody gets that, but better understanding than the average panic response. Enough understanding to remain calm, enough to ask the right questions, enough to notice when someone is trying to recruit your fear for their agenda. There is also something worth saying about resilience. Human beings are strange creatures. We are capable of tremendous stupidity and tremendous wisdom, often within the same week. We build fragile systems and then act surprised when they crack. But we also repair, redesign, adapt, and learn. History is full of dreadful passages, but it is also full of recovery. World wars ended. Financial crises passed. Supply shocks were absorbed. Institutions failed and were rebuilt. New industries emerged where old assumptions collapsed. None of this means pain is trivial. It means collapse is not the only possible outcome. But recovery favors the prepared. It favors the clear-minded. It favors people who can hold two truths at once: that the situation is dangerous and that panic makes it worse. So if I had to compress everything into one final idea, it would be this: be the calm, competent person in the room. Not the loudest person, not the most outraged person, not the person repeating slogans. Be the person who asks what the mechanism is. Be the person who checks assumptions. Be the person who can explain to others, in plain language, why a narrow strait matters, why energy prices ripple outward, why alliances shift, why prolonged wars become expensive, why incentives matter, why information should be diversified, why fear should not be outsourced to politicians or algorithms. That kind of person is tremendously valuable in a confused age. And confusion is precisely what we have now. If the Strait of Hormuz reopens soon, some of the acute pressure may ease. If diplomacy regains traction, the system may step back from wider disaster. If not, the consequences could deepen, not only in the Middle East, but across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Either way, what matters for you is not only what governments do next, it is what you do next with your own attention, judgment, relationships, and preparation, because history is not lived by headlines, it is lived by people. And in times like this, the people who come through strongest are not always the richest or the most powerful. Very often they are the ones who kept their minds working when others surrendered theirs to fear. So stay alert, stay skeptical, stay humane, and above all, keep asking the most useful question there is: what is really going on here? Because once you begin asking that honestly, you are already less helpless than you were before.